Welcome,
Okay.
everyone. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, a quick note on the language settings. You can select your preferred language by connecting to the available channels in the Zoom menu. Bienvenidos a todas y todas. Antes de empezar, una breve instrucción sobre el idioma. Pueden conectarse a los canales disponibles en el menú de Zoom para seleccionar su idioma preferido. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Rod Havriluk, President of the Swimming Technology Research, STR, a leading expert in the biomechanics of swimming. Dr. Havriluk has established decades of research to optimizing technique and reducing injuries. In today's session, shoulder injury, prevalence, technique causes, and technique remedies, Dr. Havriluk will provide valuable insights into why shoulder injuries are so common in swimming, identifying key techniques-related causes and evidence-based solutions. To participate in the question and answers, feel free to submit your questions through the Zoom menu at any time. Now, let's get started. Dr. Havriluk, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I begin the presentation, I want to first acknowledge Ted Becker. He has been a fantastic person to collaborate with. He's not only got a PhD in biomechanics, but he's a physical therapist as well. And we've worked together since we were students at Indiana University. Okay, my slide is not advancing. There we go. Okay, it's important to realize that swimming shoulder may have many different names. They all indicate compressing and irritating the soft tissue between the bones, but it could be any of these names. There have been about 50 studies on shoulder injuries in the past 50 years. And as you can see, in just about all the studies, at least 20% of the swimmers have shoulder injuries. That's 1 in 5. You can be pretty much guaranteed that 1 in 5 people on your team have a shoulder injury. And in a lot of the studies, there's more than 50% of the team. I want to point out a study by Scott Rodeo in 2011, where he looked at the 2012 USA Olympic team, and he found that 2/3 of the Olympians had shoulder injury. That's how common shoulder injury is. And I must add that these are the people who indicate they have shoulder injuries. Very often, there are swimmers who, for one reason or another, don't admit that they have a shoulder injury. In a recent study, the number of shoulder injuries with respect to age group was analyzed. And it's not a surprise that the older swimmers had more shoulder injuries than the younger ones. The 15 to 17-year-old age group, almost 1/4 of the swimmers reported shoulder injury at the time of the study. And really, unfortunately, is that about 10% of the 9 and 10-year-old reported shoulder injury. And now the number of injuries with respect to stroke was analyzed. It's about 20 years ago, but it's probably hasn't changed since then much. And you can see that butterfly and freestyle is responsible for the majority of injuries. And that's what I will focus on in this presentation. This study was conducted at Brazil National Championships. Over 50% of the swimmers at the championships had a shoulder injury, and in most cases, it was shoulder tendonitis. So here's a swimmer who has just completed the arm entry. Notice her hand is just below the surface, and her shoulder is just slightly below that. Very typical for a male to do this too. The hand is very close to the surface. The shoulder is a little bit below that. Butterfly, hands just below the surface, shoulders a little bit below that. However, in butterfly, we often see the hands near the surface and the shoulders considerably below that. And in this case, the shoulders are about as deep as you can get them. So this is an extremely stressful position to be in, but it's not uncommon. This is a university swimmer. Here's another swimmer where her hands are just below the shoulders, indicated by the yellow line. Her shoulders are very submerged, and her neck is flexed so that her head is completely below her shoulders. Now, that's about as stressful a position as you can get it. She has her arms internally rotated. She's doing just about everything you can do to stress your shoulders. And here's a big surprise. She came to me because she had a shoulder problem. Well, here's why swimmers have shoulder problems. This image shows the gap between the upper arm and the shoulder. Here's the upper arm, here's the shoulder, and that's the gap. As the arm is elevated, the size of that gap is reduced and is just about non-existent when the arm gets overhead. Now, looking at this image, you see that the upper arm, called the humerus, and the shoulder, called the acromion, has soft tissue in between those two bones. There's a bursa, there's a tendon, and as the arm is elevated, the bursa and the tendon are compressed. They're impinged on. They're irritated. And that irritation is called bursitis or tendinitis. And that's why those injuries are so common. Now, if you do that once or twice, you don't have to worry. But swimmers often compress that tissue 1,000,000 times in a season. And that's where there's a big problem. So here's a typical female entry. The hand higher than the shoulder. Here's a typical male entry. The hand is the same level as the shoulder in this image. So here's a female with a typical arm entry, hand above the shoulder. Here's the position of a male at the same level, with a hand at the same level as the shoulder. And here's an effective arm entry with the hand below the shoulder. So the time that it takes to go from the typical arm entry of either the female or the male to an effective arm entry is called the exposure time to shoulder stress. And this name was, Ted Becker came up with this name. So we conducted several studies, and we found that swimmers usually complete the arm entry either above the shoulder or level with the shoulder. It is very rare for a swimmer to complete the arm entry with the hand below the shoulder. You see, and it was only males and only in a few cases. We conducted another study, and once again, the swimmers completed the arm entry with the hand above the shoulder or level with the shoulder, but it was very rare for a swimmer to complete the arm entry with the hand below the shoulder. Now, this exposure time to shoulder stress that I showed you in a previous slide, it's an important part of the underwater hand motion. It can be at least 1/10 of a second, and sometimes even over 3/10 of a second. Now, that's a substantial proportion of the stroke cycle. If a stroke cycle only takes a second or a little bit more, even if there's 1/10 of a second of exposure time, that's around 10% of the time that the hand is cycling through a stroke. Now, if you think about a swimmer wasting 10% of every single stroke, how much faster they could go, in addition to how much less stress would be on the shoulder. That it's worth addressing this issue. With an arm entry that is even with the shoulder, as you can see, a swimmer is really just pushing down. So there's nothing propulsive in that initial motion. So here's a swimmer with her force curves. She's just completed the arm entry. She's just starting to generate hand force. And for the first 2/10 of a second, she's generating a minimal amount of force. So that wasted time is not only stressful on her shoulder, but it impacts her performance. It's 2/10 of a second that is just about completely wasted. Here's a male swimming butterfly. Same story. He's got about 2/10 of a second of minimal force. It's not until his hands get below his shoulders that he's able to generate a considerable amount of force. So that's 2/10 of a second of wasted effort. So with the typical arm entry, we not only have stress on the shoulder, but we have a fair amount of time that limits performance. With a modified arm entry, we minimize that shoulder stress and improve performance. So on the left, we have a swimmer who's in an ineffective arm entry position. And on the right, we have a biomechanical model who has completed her arm entry with her hands below her shoulders. The water level is at the yellow line. So we can see that the head and shoulders of the swimmer is considerably below the surface, whereas the swimmer is keeping her head, the biomechanical model is keeping her head at the surface and has her hands below her shoulders. When we look at the force curves, we see 2/10 of a second that the swimmer is wasting, that is exposing his shoulders to stress, But the biomechanical model is able to begin generating propulsion right away. The entry phase, from the time the hands enter the water until the hands get in position to generate propulsion, can be a very short amount of time. This image shows that in freestyle, it's a very brief period that it can be. It usually isn't. It's usually a considerable amount of time, but it can be a very short amount of time. Same with butterfly. It can be a very short amount of the stroke cycle. Now, here's a female who worked on her arm entry. Her hands have entered the water just slightly below her shoulders. She's a very young teenager, but her technique is similar to the biomechanical model. She's about to begin the pull. And she can begin generating a substantial amount of propulsion by immediately flexing her elbows, similar to the biomechanical model. So in this image, we've got an effective arm entry for a freestyler, biomechanical model of a freestyler on the left, and a biomechanical model of a butterflyer on the right. And we see in both cases, the model is entering the water with her hands very close to her head. She's got a downward angle. So by the bottom image, she's completed the arm entry with her hands below her shoulders. This is not only reducing the stress on her shoulders, but it puts her in a position where she can begin generating propulsion immediately. So the protocol that I would recommend is to, first of all, swim at a short distance to modify the technique. And by short distance, I mean maybe not one length of the pool, maybe only half of a length of a pool, maybe less than 10 yards or meters with a younger swimmer. Swim at a slow stroke rate with non-breathing strokes. So again, you may have to gauge the distance so that a swimmer can not move their head, not have to breathe and move their head to take that variable out of the equation so that they can just focus on their arms and ensure that their hand enters the water lower than their shoulders. The cues that I would recommend is, first of all, to feel the hand enter the water close to the head. Second of all, to feel the arms or arms straighten and see the hands below the shoulders simultaneously. And if a swimmer accomplishes that, they'll just see clear water. They won't see any bubbles. With a typical arm entry, there are often a great deal of bubbles. So this is something that most swimmers will see a dramatic difference in. Now, coaches are often tempted to model the fastest swimmers in the world. Here is one of the fastest swimmers in the world in the top image. Here's the biomechanical model in the bottom image. The swimmer in the top image has the arm straight in line with the shoulder. The biomechanical model has the hand below the shoulder. The swimmer in the top image had just set the 100-meter freestyle world record at the last Olympics. This image is from that swim. Here's a butterflyer in a very, very stressful position. Here's the surface of the water. Here's a biomechanical model that you can compare the swimmer with. The arms are pointed towards the surface. The biomechanical model has the arms pointed towards the bottom of the pool. Very different angle at the shoulders. The swimmer in the top image is Phelps. And I'm sure you can appreciate that this is a far more stressful position on the shoulders than the biomechanical model. In conclusion, I would implore you to modify the freestyle and butterfly arm entry so that there's less time to shoulder stress and so that the swimmers go faster. This is a double bonus. And unfortunately, there are very, very few swimmers that take advantage of this. So here's the 9-year-old girl that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. When she first came to me, she would typically enter the water with her arms in that position. And there's the surface of the water, shown by the yellow line. She came back in June and was still submerging the head below the surface, but at least the hands were below the shoulders at the completion of the arm entry. And then when she came back in December, she did a better job of keeping the head at least close to the surface with her hands below her shoulders. So this, it may take a while to change some of these swimmers, because with some of the swimmers, you're dealing with people who have performed millions of repetitions of a certain technique. So changing that technique can take a considerable amount of time. Naturally, underwater video helps. It helps to have that force data on swimmers. But with butterfly, at least you can see if the head stays at the surface and then the hands submerge. Very often, heads will submerge as well as hands. But this is a technique that is difficult to evaluate from the surface. Underwater video is very, very helpful. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
So, Rod, we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
So I've just had to translate them into English, but
Okay.
so apologies to whoever asked it if it is slightly off. So the shoulder injuries we see in swimming are common due to poor rotational mechanics, like you talked about. Can we apply the same therapy techniques that medical specialists in other fields might look at for other injuries? So can you apply medical treatments for other shoulder injuries to swimming, or are there specific considerations?
Well, this is pretty specific. Impinging that soft tissue between the bones can certainly happen with many other activities, but there aren't that many activities where we're performing millions of repetitions. So swimming is really an isolated case because of how often we impinge that soft tissue. Does that answer that question?
I think so, but I also see that the person who asked it added some additional details, and I think they've got a specific case. So here, if you are willing, Victor, can you please use the raise hand feature? And if you do that, I will give you permission to ask the question verbally with the kind of the specifics you are looking for. All right, give me a second. So go ahead and speak in whichever language you prefer, and our lovely translator will make it work for everyone. Oh, there, you should be able to do it now.
¿Me copian? ¿Me copian? ¿Me copian?
We
Sí.
can hear you.
Ok. Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes. Ante todo, mi nombre es Víctor Daniel Perdigón Osorio, instructor de natación, licenciado en Actividad Física y Salud. Mi pregunta la hice fraccionada porque formulando, ya que no había recordado especificar el tema de, yo soy, aparte de instructor de natación, siempre me han llegado nadadores donde recomiendan la natación como terapia rehabilitadora del hombro. Y siempre he dicho que es paradójico el que el nadador es muy habitual las lesiones de hombro por las rotaciones constantes que hay del hombro y bueno, hay una contracción y se genera la irritación. Pero los médicos recomiendan la natación como un ente terapéutico o un medio terapéutico, perdón, para rehabilitar el hombro de no nadadores. Entonces, me gustaría saber si nosotros podemos aplicar a estos nadadores, si hay otra metodología que se puede aplicar en nadadores, ya que utilizamos la natación para rehabilitar el hombro de patologías distintas, pues bien sea la causa, puede ser otra causa, un impacto, un golpe o un mal movimiento. Y la natación es la recomendable para mejorar el hombro. Entonces, es bastante paradójico, ¿no? Que hagamos lesiones en hombro, la natación. Es común, me imagino, por la cantidad de rotaciones que tenemos, pues. Pero es un un medio terapéutico, perdón, para rehabilitar el hombro. Entonces, es bastante, me causa risa bastante, ¿no? Pero disertante, si podemos utilizar estos medios que utilizamos para rehabilitar y también a nuestros propios nadadores, pues. Muchas gracias.
Okay. Rod, did you get that in English?
No, I got it in Spanish.
Okay.
Quite a
So
question.
it's all right. Rod, what I'll ask you to do is on your bottom menu, find the button that looks like a globe and click on English. And as you do that, I will relay the question that I heard. So apologies, Victor. Thank you. It was a great question. I'll try to do my best to do it justice here. So the question is, oh, Rod, you can stop sharing screen.
Okay.
So the question is that there's so many injuries, and for injuries that happen outside of swimming, people like physiotherapists will often recommend swimming as a rehab activity for people who have injured themselves in another way, be it in some kind of impact or overuse in another setting. And they recommend swimming as a rehab exercise for those individuals to rebuild shoulder strength. do you have any thoughts or comments about how that intersects or contradicts anything that you have just spoken about or seen in your research? Apologies, Victor, if I've missed some of the subtleties of your question, but I believe that was the core of it.
Well, I would say that a person who is in that situation is taking a risk by swimming. That's on one side of it. On the other side of it, the person's probably not going to swim that much. So the activity, it's unlikely that they're going to hurt themselves anymore because of swimming. It's a whole different story between swimmers and non-swimmers. The average person who just swims performs so few repetitions, whereas a competitive swimmer swims many repetitions. So that's tremendously different. And it's unlikely to me that someone who's participating in other activities is going to hurt themselves further by swimming.
All right, thank you for that, Victor. Can you just confirm quickly if that generally answers your question?
Sí, ¿me copia? ¿Me copia?
Perfect. Thank
Ok,
you. Thank
sí,
you
no,
for the
perfecto,
question.
perfecto.
And I'm just going to
Respuesta acertada y bueno, seguiremos en la investigación para mejorar este tipo de trabajo, que hay que profundizar más y ampliar más este trabajo, ya que nos llegan cantidades de atletas o nadadores o personas que quieren aprender a nadar, pero traen una condición médica que nos ayuda. Pues entonces, bueno, tratar al paciente, o perdón, al atleta con lesiones, pero tratar a nuestros propios nadadores con la misma lesión. Muchas gracias.
Perfect. Thank you. Going back to the question and answers. So what types of exercises might you recommend for kind of training a good and proper arm entry into the water to make it strong, durable, and sustainable?
Well, simulating technique in front of a mirror can often help, because a swimmer will learn better how to control their body. Once they get in the water, as I said, have them swimming a very short distance, particularly if someone who's already injured. Now, hand paddles can be an effective learning device to learn how to modify the entry. That can put a lot more stress on the shoulder if they are using an ineffective arm entry. So you have to be really careful about using paddles, but paddles can provide tremendous feedback about shoulder injury. So often swimmers are advised to stop wearing paddles when they're injured. Well, I would stop wearing them for training, but I would continue to wear them to modify technique. But the combination of simulating technique in front of a mirror, swimming a very short distance, and then attempting to modify technique with paddles, those are three ways of changing the arm entry.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We have more questions. So apart from shoulder biomechanics, are there any other risk factors you would consider when talking about shoulder injuries in swimmers?
Oh, are there other risk factors? Wow.
Can you speak to some other risk factors? Because
Yeah. Yeah. Excessive training distance is, in fact, Ted, my co-author, wrote a paper about this a long time ago. In addition to the arm entry, that excessive training distance, and then also muscular imbalances. Excessive training distance, it's incredible how many repetitions some swimmers perform in a workout. And you have to realize, even if a swimmer has started working on modifying their technique, after they've swum a considerable amount of distance, it's likely they will revert back to their to the technique they've learned best, which is an ineffective arm entry. And to make this even a worse situation, they put if they're tired, they put their arm in the water and just leave it there. The torso rotates, so this puts the hand above the shoulder, even if they have entered with the hand at the same level as the shoulder. When they rotate, the hand is now higher, closer to the surface than the shoulder. So that's going to put more stress on the shoulder. So excessive training distance it's critical to avoid that. Or really with any swimmer, but much less, but much more important with swimmers that have a shoulder injury. And then another problem is muscular imbalances. It's really surprising how unsymmetrical so many swimmers are. We've done force testing on, and many other groups have done that, where they've looked at the symmetry of breaststrokers and butterflyers, and found that even 25% of the swimmers are imbalanced, which you wouldn't guess that. I mean, you'd think that breaststroke and butterfly, you're going to be pretty symmetrical, and you expect to be unsymmetrical in freestyle and backstroke, but breaststroke and butterfly, it's not unusual to be unsymmetrical. So that can wear on the shoulders as well. And, well, okay, I'll wait for another question, but there's more I want to say.
So maybe that works well, because this is kind of a related question to kind of symmetry across swimming techniques. So apologies, I'm trying to work through the question properly. So do injuries occur in similar ways? Are there relations between the injuries seen in backstroke and breaststroke? Because we see in the biomechanical analysis of butterfly and front crawl, that's kind of I'm not getting the translation very well. Marissa, are you able to help with the second question in the Q&A? If you type out an answer and answer it typed, I can work with that. Marissa, I see you're trying to answer it live. Are you able to type it? Because I can't hear what you are saying for the translation. Well, Marissa works on that. I have another question. So for free and butterfly, we tell our swimmers for entry that fingers should be lower than the wrist lower than the elbow lower than shoulder. Do you have any thoughts on that guidance. Is that correct? Do you have any tips, comments?
Oh, I'm thrilled to hear that. I do have a question. Are they seeing that? Are they seeing their hand below their shoulder at the instant the arm straightens?
That I don't know.
Well, that would be the way to evaluate it.
Right. So are you actually seeing what you're telling them to do?
Right.
Okay. And we have another question.
Let me add that if a swimmer is not seeing it, is it because they're using an ineffective arm entry, or is it because their head's too low? In other words, the hand might not be deep enough, but also they might need to adjust their head position so they can see the hand complete the entry.
That makes sense.
It's all science. It has to make sense.
And just from the same coach, how does this work with backstroke? Swimmers tend to keep their elbows straight on the pull portion.
Yeah, it's the problems I've seen on backstroke are it's more of an individual case, and same with breaststroke. The generalization I can make about backstroke is that very often swimmers will complete the arm entry with the hand behind the opposite shoulder. So that's going to be a very stressful position. Swimmers will often waste a couple tenths of a second just moving the hand from putting it in the water to where they can exert any force at all behind the shoulder on the same side as the hand. Breaststrokers, again, an underwater video is probably necessary to see this, but swimmers will often begin the pull with their hands moving towards the surface, and their head moving, staying at maybe a foot below the surface. So they'll put considerable stress on their shoulders that way.
Okay, thank you for that. And continuing on the same flow of questions, can you speak to the importance of hip music and movement and freestyle entries?
Head movement and freestyle entries? Well, actually, very little head motion is necessary.
Sorry, Rod, hip, HIP, hip.
Oh, hip motion. I haven't seen that as a factor. In other words, if a swimmer has torso rotation where the hips are rotating with the shoulders, that seems to be the case most of the time. So I don't see that as factors impacting shoulder injuries.
Okay, thank you. Do have that translation, so thank you, Marissa, for that. So if the injuries occur equally with backstroke and breaststroke, as we see in biomechanical analysis, as in crawl and butterfly, is this in the same, the injury occurs equally with backstroke and breaststroke, as we see the biomechanical analysis in crawl and butterfly, and if it is in the same range in training swimmers. Do you understand what that means?
I'm not sure of what the question is.
Unfortunately, I am not either. So, William, if you're able to ask that, if you were able to reword that in a Q&A, it would help us to understand your question and answer it better if it has not been answered already. In backstroke entries, should the elbow be bent first before the pull?
Well, with an ideal arm entry, the hand will enter directly behind the shoulder. The arm will submerge and the torso will rotate simultaneously so that the hand is below the shoulder, similar to freestyle. At that point, elbow flexion begins the pull. Is that sufficient?
I would think so. We're getting to the end of our questions. If we aren't able to get that one adjusted. So going back to what you were talking about earlier, when you're talking about looking in the mirror and adjusting your, like reviewing your technique that way, do you have any exercises? And by exercises, I'm guessing they mean gym or strength type building exercises for the correction of hand entry technique as mentioned above. Because you talked about the mirror, you talked about some hand paddle stuff, but you have other exercises you might consider for correcting hand entry.
I think anything land-based is going to work a whole lot slower than the swimmer attempting to modify the technique in the water. A mirror exercise on the land, I don't encourage that for very long. They should just try that to see the difference between an effective and an ineffective arm entry, how they control their arms to make an effective arm entry. But and any other land-based exercise is going to be far less productive than getting a swimmer in the water.
Okay, thank you for that. And that does make sense. And for now, the last question that we have is regarding the position of the head in butterfly. Should it be the same as the hands below the shoulders?
Yeah, if the head position is such that in freestyle is such that a swimmer is looking at a 45-degree angle, they should be able to see the arm entry. They should be able to see the hand pass beneath the head. So in other words, they can see the whole pull phase. Butterfly is very similar. They probably have their head slightly higher than freestyle because they're breathing in extending their neck in butterfly. So the head doesn't assume a position, a non-breathing position, where they're looking down quite as much as in freestyle. They'll be looking ahead a little bit more, but they should be able to see the arm entry and evaluate the arm entry visually in both strokes. And that's really important, to be able to evaluate it visually as opposed to kinesthetically feeling the arm entry. Humans prioritize what they see as opposed to what they feel. So it's really important that they see it. So that's the first question I would ask a swimmer if they have shoulder pain. What do you see on the arm entry? when the elbow locks, when the arm becomes straight, can you see your hand?
Okay, thank you for that. So when we're talking about injured athletes, for example, tendonitis, bursitis, that type of injury, while they're working on their rehab, can they continue training? And if so, what do you recommend they do in their training?
Swim very slowly, less distance, and make sure they're controlling the entry every time on every stroke. And again, I will encourage the coaches to minimize the excessive training distance, because when a swimmer gets fatigued, even if they have the best intentions of modifying their technique, they'll probably revert back to the best learned technique of an ineffective arm entry. And while I'm on this topic, catch-up stroke is probably the most common drill in competitive swimming. This is just asking for shoulder injuries. It's counterproductive as far as swimming fast, but it's just asking for a shoulder injury. So there is two huge reasons not to ever do catch-up stroke.
All right, thank you for that. We have no more questions in the question and answer, so we'll give it about 30 seconds or so, and if there are no more questions, we will wrap up there, unless, Rod, you have more you'd like to add on anything.
Well, I could go on, but I think I've said enough.
All right, well, we'll give people a couple more seconds to finish typing their questions if they have any more. But otherwise, we'll wrap up for this session. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think everyone has got all of their questions typed out and asked. So thank you, Rod, for your time. Oh, just as I started, we get one more. Do you have any specific camera recommendations for monitoring for use underwater as you're?
Yeah, you mean what camera to use?
Yeah, what cameras do you recommend for when you're doing analysis of underwater technique?
Well, I wasn't planning on putting in a commercial, but we offer underwater cameras and also force analysis device. Our Aquatics device measures forces and simultaneously gets an underwater video.
Okay.
It can be a real eye opener if you've got the force data, because a technique can look really good. It can look like a swimmer is entering the water very well, but they don't immediately start to generate force. So there's there can be time that's wasted just because the arm has completed an effective entry but has not begun the pull. That happens too.
Okay. Thank you. We had a couple more questions come in as you were answering that. So can you speak a little bit more to what the hand entry looks like in backstroke?
Well, I'm just going to repeat what I said before. Well, I'll add a little bit to it. First of all, is all a swimmer can see of the arm is while it's recovering. So at least the swimmer can see that the hand's in line with the same side of the body. Now, unfortunately, the hand will go out of sight before it hits the water. So here's where you have to make sure that the arm stays about a fist width from the side of the head. That's about right. Make sure that the arm is not hitting the head. Make sure that the arm is staying far enough away from the head so that the hand can enter the water directly behind the shoulder. As the hand enters the water, it must submerge simultaneous with the torso rotation. And at the completion of the arm entry, the hand should be deeper than the shoulder and in line with the shoulder. When the hand has submerged to that point, then the pull can begin by flexing the elbow.
Okay, thank you. Questions are rolling in now.
Yeah, well, can I add a little bit to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Flexing the elbow is so critical to begin any of the pulls in any of the 4 strokes. In other words, immediately after the entry has been completed, or in breaststroke, immediately after the swimmer has gotten into the glide position, elbow flexion must begin to initiate the pull phase. So in all 4 strokes, elbow flexion will put the arm or arms in a stronger position than if the arm is straight. When that elbow begins to bend, it can generate more force than a straight arm. So it's necessary to begin all 4 strokes with elbow flexion.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any stretches you would recommend to help mitigate shoulder injury risks?
No, I really don't.
Okay, and
Again, anything land-based is going to be much less productive than what's done in water.
okay. And then we have one person asking if you can send some information about your video and analysis device. So I guess your commercial worked. So what we can do, Rod, if you send some information about it to Alvaro, who did the introduction, he can include a link to it for the name, whatever information you'd like in the recap email.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Anyone is welcome to go to my website too, swimmingtechnology.com, because there's far more information about this and a lot of other technique issues. And there's many things that can be downloaded for free.
All right. Well, I think that does exhaust all of our questions for real now. So thank you, Rod, for your time today.
My pleasure.
Lots of great information that hopefully helps prevent some future injuries and or speed up recovery time in the future. We appreciate your time, all of your expertise. Thank you everyone for joining. There was some great participation, some really good questions. So thank you for your involvement. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day and weekend.
Okay, well, thank you.
All right, goodbye.